the Metro on 1019 WDET FM, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. And today we're talking diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI. In his first week in office, President Trump issued executive orders aimed to reduce and end diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. He and many other conservative voices have been critical of the programs. Some have even called them racist. Now, supporters of DEI initiatives argue the programming creates environments where all people, regardless of their backgrounds, can thrive. And we want to hear from you. Should diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives be shut down? Have they been effective? The phone lines are open 313-577-1019. And here to catch us up on what's happening with all of this is one of the Metro's mighty producers, Carrie Jr. II. Carrie, thanks for joining us on this side of the show.
I really like mighty. I appreciate that descriptor. That's nice.
Yes. We could do so many others.
Like an oak tree, a mighty oak tree.
Yes, brilliant and wonderful. We're going to stop.
Okay.
Yeah,
I appreciate it. Yeah. So I want me to catch up on what's going on with DEI. So what we know in the news, President Trump, certainly he kept the promises he made during the campaign that he was going to reduce diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. On his first day, he signed an executive order. It was titled Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferencing, effectively banning DEI efforts at the federal level. And then the very next day, a memo issued by the U.S. Office of Personnel Management instructed agencies to place its DEI staffers on leave. So those are immediate actions that President Trump took as soon as he got into office.
And this is affecting thousands of people. So I'm guessing there has been some kind of strong response. Is that right?
Yeah, there's been a strong response from folks who have been placed on leave. There've been strong responses from organizations and institutions in states across the country. We've seen a lot of talk about reducing DEI efforts over the last few years. And when the Supreme Court ruled against race-based affirmative action 2 years ago, critics against DEI soon followed. After that, that's when we started seeing companies scale down their diversity initiatives. And so now we're just seeing more companies reduce those initiatives. They're starting to cut and reduce those programmings. And then we're also seeing that some businesses have pledged to stay the course and continue their programming in DEI. Some have also, they've been like, we're going to continue doing what we've been doing. But there's been a lot of businesses who've followed suit.
What do you think this is going to mean on the local level? Are we going to potentially see more DEI efforts fizzle out?
Ooh, that's complicated. I will say on the university front, some state institutions were already weary about how to respond, and many of them receive federal funding. And so the schools don't want to be out of compliance with what the federal government requires those institutions to do. So depending on where you live, depending on the institution and what their initiatives are, there might be some changes there at your local school. When it comes to local businesses and communities, we still have to see. We have to see what those impacts are. It depends on the local jurisdictions. It depends on what those partnerships look like between local businesses and what those initiatives, if there are initiatives that are funding those businesses. But it's been a big ball of confusion, essentially, based off of what Trump has initially said.
Carrie, thank you so much for filling us in on what's been going on with DEI efforts at the federal level and how it could potentially impact us here on the local level. But Robin, just bringing it to, bringing it home for us, journalistically, I guess you can say. What involvement have you had with DEI efforts in your career?
Yeah, I will say that after the murder of George Floyd, I noticed a lot of newsrooms had this coming to Jesus moment. They really started assessing themselves and saying, how diverse are our newsrooms? Do they really reflect the diversity of America? And I helped create a DEI statement in a previous newsroom that I was in, and it was really a guiding document for us. It focused on inclusivity and the need for our newsroom to reflect the diversity of the communities that we were serving. So we were using language that highlighted the need for people from many different walks of life to be a part of our team. So people with disabilities, older people, people from the queer community, along with different races and ethnicities. And the general thrust of that statement was that we can do a better job as journalists, as a media organization, if we are bringing people to our team who have diverse life experiences.
Robin, that's the beautiful thing about getting to work here at WDET is we are surrounded by folks like you and myself and Carrie and Dave and Sam and Jack and just so many folks, our interns, Trevor and Lauren. We were surrounded by so many folks from so many diverse backgrounds. It's hard not to learn more and learn about your place in this world. So I love that we have that happening here. And Carrie, yeah.
Can I add, I feel like with journalism too, because we are storytellers, right? We want to hear a variety of different stories. I do think once we get into other avenues and other segments, it becomes a little bit harder for people to clearly understand what DEI is for and what it's doing. I mean, critics and proponents on both sides have different interpretations of what it is. Like I said before, a ball of confusion. Like people are like, wait, what does this really mean? Sometimes I'm confused. I'll hear corporations say, we're going to implement DEI initiatives. I'm like, okay, sounds like I think I have an idea of what that means, but I don't have a tangible understanding of what that looks like. So I'm hoping our guests, and I'm looking forward to our guests, kind of shedding some light on that for us today.
Hopefully they can be a clarifying voice for us. Thank you, Carrie, for the brief overview. And we're taking your calls. We already have one phone call. Layla in Detroit, should the government get rid of its DEI initiatives?
Oh, gosh, I wasn't prepared for that question. I guess the short answer is no. The longer answer has to do with, so I grew up in a time when exclusion was the normal, and I think DEI initiatives have started to create a new normal, and people don't really realize the effects because they've never lived in a society where they have been excluded. As a visible Muslim, I could not, where I grew up, be out in public or play sports or do anything comfortably wearing a scarf. And now, that normal is changing. To your point about having diverse voices, this is how we learn. How do we know what we don't know if we're not exposed to diverse voices? So it's just really bad, really bad for our society in general to do away with these initiatives. There's a further question as to whether the initiatives were implemented properly in the first place, but that means we should revamp them, not do away with that principle altogether.
And Layla, as briefly as you can, you are experiencing the effects of this DEI halt on a professional level. Is that right?
Yeah. I'm a professor at Wayne State, and a colleague, her NSF funding has been halted, and she's not sure whether it's going to be reinstated. She doesn't know how she's going to pay her postdocs, and the work that she's doing is so vital. But yeah, we're feeling it.
Layla, thank you so much for calling the Metro. We'll get to more of your calls this hour. Should DEI on the federal level come to an end, or on the local level as well? What is at risk? The number is 313-577-1019.
This is The Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. You just heard from Robin Vincent. I'm Tia Graham. And joining us now on The Metro to further explain DEI and its place in our society is Professor Ella F. Washington. Professor Washington is an organizational psychologist, a professor of practice at Georgetown University, and the author of the book Necessary Journey: Making Real Progress of Equity and Inclusion. Professor Washington, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro.
Hello, good morning. Thank you so much for having me.
Of course. So Professor Washington, what are the origins of DEI? Where does the idea that companies should be encouraged to create more inclusive workplaces come from?
So there's a long history of what we know today as diversity, equity, and inclusion, but it first got its roots in affirmative action during the 1960s. President Kennedy signed an executive order introducing the term affirmative action, mandating businesses avoid discrimination and create fair hiring practices. Now, the affirmative action legislation was further reinforced by Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which made employment discrimination illegal based on race, color, religion, sex, and national origin. In 2020, that was updated to include gender identity and sexual orientation. So there's a long history, as I mentioned, of this work, right? It didn't just start in 2020, as some people would have us believe. And through the last 40 plus years, there has been a continual shift in the pendulum of when at times there's support for DEI, and at times there are people who are against DEI. And so part of what I like to share with folks is that this is a long history, and we didn't just arrive at this overnight. And certainly we have seen pushback before, from in the 1960s and 70s when there was some pushback from affirmative action, to the 1980s where there was further pushback. And so this is not a new conversation that's been had. We are using new terminology. There are new elements of pushing back, such as rescinding some of those executive orders from the 1960s, as we saw last week with President Trump. But the core of this conversation around providing equitable and inclusive experiences at work is certainly not new.
And Professor Washington, it isn't new. We, just like you said, we know the civil rights movement. We know all of the things that were happening throughout our country's history in terms of equity and inclusion, and those who pushed against it and continue to push against it today. So how has that pushback evolved? What does it look like today, especially with the integration of technology and everything else we see happening in our world?
Well, at the core, diversity, equity, and inclusion is about people. So, not surprising that the work has to evolve as our organizations evolve, as how we work evolves, as you said, technology evolves. And so, it wasn't until really the 1980s when the Secretary of Labor at the time commissioned a study called Workforce 2000 by the Hudson Institute. The purpose of that study was to understand what would happen in the year 2000. For those of us old enough to remember Y2K and how everyone was scared of what would happen in 2000, well, the Bureau of Labor, was also part of that fear of, okay, what's going to happen to our workforce, and especially in relation to being a global competitor, right? And so that study was one of the largest studies at the time. Over 300 corporations participated in the study, and the results of the study were absolutely important for that time. The study found that in order to continue to be productive and to be competitive in the global labor force, the United States needed to maximize its talent pool. And specifically, it needed to maximize using women in the workforce and minorities, specifically Black Americans and Hispanic Americans. And so from that point, when that report came out in 1987, you then see much more investment, not only from the federal government and funding for efforts to understand more about what was then called diversity management, but also from corporations understanding that this is a way we are going to remain competitive in the global landscape moving forward. And so that is kind of where you see the impetus of what we know today as DEI, particularly from the lens of corporations in the workplace.
Professor Washington, what motivated companies to start adopting the DEI practices in the first place? I know for some of us, we kind of understand it around 2020 with George Floyd and in the current moment. But when did we start to see DEI practices adopted or, and being motivated by the companies?
Yeah, great question. And I'm so glad you called out that, it didn't start in 2020. So as I mentioned, after that Workforce 2000 report, that's where we see diversity management come into play and just diversity in general. And you see a large influx of research in the academic space around what diversity was all about, how it had an impact on workplaces. And you see organizations start to be very intentional and start to invest in diversity practices. Now, what they were investing in at that time was diversity in terms of representation. And so from the late 80s through the 90s, really, we see most companies really focus on representation, focus on hiring, focus on who they're bringing into the organizations. And what was really clear by late 90s, early 2000s is that actually wasn't working. One, organizations were struggling to recruit and, more importantly, maintain diverse workforce individuals because they weren't thinking about inclusion at all. And so in the early 2000s, there's a lot of research that's done, and organizations are shifting their language to diversity and inclusion, understanding that diversity itself, just adding different demographics into the mix, doesn't work if you don't have inclusion. And so that's something that we kind of hold true even till today, based on research and based on the experience, that just because you have a diverse group of people in a room does not mean that they feel included. And so we see that shift to the early 2010s. Then in the 2010 era, we see some companies first start to look at equity as part of the equation. But certainly it wasn't until 2020 that we see almost all companies at least consider or add equity into their diversity and inclusion practices. And so that's where we arrive at DEI today. Companies were thinking about, okay, diversity and inclusion has made some progress, but we're still stalled. And they thought about, okay, well, equity, as the term was becoming more popular around this work, is all about what are the structures and processes we need in place in order to make diversity and inclusion maximized. And so that's kind of how we arrived at least the terminology of what we know as DEI today.
This is the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. We're going to take a quick break, and when we come back, we'll continue talking about the uncertain future of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, or DEI, with Professor Ella F. Washington, an organizational psychologist at Georgetown University. And we want to hear from you. Should diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives be shut down? Have they been effective? What has been your experience? And what's at risk if we lose DEI programs? The phone lines are open, 313-577-1019. Stay with us. It's the Metro. Welcome back to the Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. And right now we are breaking down how diversity, equity, and inclusion works. And we are joined by Professor Ella F. Washington. She is an organizational psychologist, a professor of practice at Georgetown University, and the author of the book Necessary Journey, Making Real Progress on Equity and Inclusion. And we want to hear from you. Should diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives be shut down? What is at risk if DEI is eliminated on the federal level or at the workplace? The number is 313-577-1019. We're going to go to the phones right now, and let's start with Adela in Detroit. Adela, hello.
Yes. Oh, good morning. It's still morning. Yes, this is Adelia calling in from downtown Detroit. And I just wanted to go over my experience and version of the whole DEI phenomenon that has finally taken place for, in my case, African-American professionals. And so DEI, in my perspective, was needed due to exclusion of African-Americans in corporate jobs. Hiring based on merit was not working. There was no clear rules or procedures to allow, in my case, representing the African-American professional population segment, allowing blacks into white male-run corporations in America. So now this ruling is gone as of a couple of days ago, I guess. So I'm concerned about African-American firms securing imperative corporate contracts today, and that isn't part of a DEI program at all. I don't think DEI was a part of the business side of it. I think it was exclusively for professional people being ushered into corporations because of the lack of diversity in those professional workplaces.
Adelia in Detroit, thank you so much for giving us that tidbit there. Professor Washington, how effective have corporate DEI initiatives been actually?
Well, I'm really grateful for Adelia's comments to bring, life to the experiences people have had in the workplace and why these efforts are really important. And so as we're thinking about, how DEI looks today, it does look different than maybe what Adelia was, experiencing and what my parents have experienced and grandparents have experienced. There was a lot of compliance-based efforts at the beginning of this journey. And some companies actually never moved beyond compliance. They were checking the box on making sure they weren't discriminating, but they actually weren't considering the experience of folks once they entered an organization, or even the fairness of the experience when they were in organizations. And so DEI, as we have known it in recent years, has been much more about thinking about the three distinct areas of DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, we always say them all in one breath, but I want to encourage us to be thoughtful about what each of those things mean. Diversity is about representation, equity is about structures and processes for fairness, and inclusion is about having a culture of belonging. And so while those things are interdependent and they do work together, they're not the same thing. And so many companies have only focused on that diversity and representation element and not been as thoughtful about those other two.
Professor Washington, I was listening to your take on this, and really, my brain started to reel because I think about, especially for people of color working in professional, quote unquote, professional corporate settings, and I think about the act of
it's not just hiring them, it's about giving them the tools and supporting folks when
respectability politics. That's what I was trying to get into there. So just this idea that we have to fit into a box in order to be in these spaces. Can you talk about how DEI initiatives, more importantly, the E and the I of that, will help these companies, help these areas be a little bit more inclusive for Black and brown people to actually feel comfortable in these spaces? So that's what I want to connect DEI with right now is actually having those spaces be comfortable. It's one thing to have people of color in the place, but it's also another thing to make them feel at home.
That's right. And, so the inclusion part of it is all about understanding and intentionally creating environments where there is psychological safety, there is a welcoming of diverse identities and viewpoints, as well as making sure that everyone kind of buys into that culture as part of the organization's values. If you know anything about organizational culture, you know that one person doesn't own a culture. It has to permeate throughout, right? And so this is not something that you can just do overnight, and it's not something that can start and stop, overnight either. And so, when we think about inclusion, there are two elements that I always tell folks that we should be thinking about inclusion. First, inclusion is a verb. So it's the active process of including someone. So if you are new to the team and I invite you out to lunch, I am excited to have you. That is me doing something, an action to include you with the team, right? Now, the second part of inclusion that is a bit more hard to codify is the feeling of belonging. Are the efforts that people are doing to make me feel more included actually making me feel more included, or are they having some other type of impact? So, for example, using the lunch example again, maybe I invite you to lunch as a way to include you with the team, but maybe you happen to be an introvert and you needed that, 30 minutes to just reset because you're new to the team and you may be overwhelmed, right? So you may not feel more included by that action, which is why it can't be something that's stagnant. We have to continuously work with a feedback loop of understanding, okay, what do employees need to feel included, and how can we create that environment that does it?
You're listening to The Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. Our guest is Professor Ella F. Washington. She's an organizational psychologist, a professor of practice at Georgetown University, and author of the book Necessary Journey, Making Real Progress on Equity and Inclusion. Professor Washington, could we talk about DEI in the present moment a little bit more, but expand our view and think about the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests that swept the world in 2020 after the deaths of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery? They really shed a light on sentiments around racial inequality internationally, around white supremacy and police brutality. And we saw major corporations pledge to support organizations that were committed to fight systemic injustices. I mean, I'm thinking about Nike and some messaging that felt a bit performative, along with some other huge corporations. How did this moment affect corporate awareness of DEI? Did it make a real dent, a lasting dent?
Well, I think we can see from the effects today that it didn't make at least enough of a lasting dent. In 2020, I, like everyone else, was shocked to see so many corporations outwardly supporting social justice, outwardly supporting racial equality, and pledging their money and resources to support those efforts, right? Now, what a lot of people don't really realize is that many of those corporations actually already had DEI efforts in place. Most of them were called diversity and inclusion or some version of that. So, there are some companies that just started their journey in 2020, and I worked with a number of those companies. But many companies had already been on the journey. But the call out during that time is that many of them hadn't been as serious and intentional with those efforts. They were still seeing gaps in their leadership around demographic diversity. Employees were saying, even at places like Nike, to your point about, performative allyship, they were saying that, we have Black people or people of color here at this organization, but we don't feel included. We don't have opportunities for advancement. And so in 2020, we saw organizations get more serious, at least in a performative way, about calling out the need for change around these efforts within their organizations. And then, of course, many of them, commented on social justice, which is, things that are happening outside of their organizations. And a lasting change. I mean, I think some organizations saw progress. Some had a lot of energy for it for the first 12 to 18 months. And then we have seen a kind of trailing off of intentionality and commitment from many organizations. And so, one thing I like to point out to folks that may not be close to this work is that we that have been doing this work have seen the pullback for DEI, not just in 2025. I mean, this started late 2022, early 2023, and certainly was exacerbated after the affirmative action Supreme Court ruling. And so the fallback from that, kind of tells us that a lot of organizations were being performative. And I want to be clear, not all, but many organizations were performative in their pledges and promises. They still have not actually paid that money. I think it was around $72 billion that was pledged between 2020 and 2020, the end of 2021, from corporations to social justice and DEI efforts. Many of those companies didn't follow through with those pledges. And those who did, they paid the money, but they haven't been intentional about continuing those efforts today.
Professor Washington, I want to stay on this notion of intentionality and connect it to what you were saying earlier about the need to delineate diversity from equity and inclusion. And I wonder if you think that one of the reasons that there have been a lot of debates about DEI, or that a lot of companies have not been able to execute it properly, is because they are missing the fundamental functionality of it, and that is they're diversifying. They're trying to hire a more diverse workforce, but they are not doing the equity and inclusion part because they don't understand it all that well in terms of, okay, you've hired this person who comes from a diverse background, but now you're not giving them the tools to succeed. And it feels, I mean, I have experienced that in newsrooms where it seemed like there was this real focus on bringing in more diversity into the newsroom, but then that was where it ended. It wasn't like, okay, this person is coming from a different background. They have different things to bring to the table. And that might also mean that we need to support them in new and different ways. And that did not materialize.
I think it's exactly what you said for most people, especially most people that are not in this space. They don't quite understand beyond demographic diversity or representation what this work is all about, because inclusion, as I mentioned before, part of it is a feeling, right? And so it's hard to really talk about that feeling of inclusion, especially if you've never felt excluded. And so in 2020, what changed for a lot of organizations, the most popular thing that was done, in addition to, of course, the financial pledges, were these candid and courageous conversations where for the first time in many organizations, people were talking about what it's like to be a person of color in that organization or what it's like to be a woman. And those conversations have been had in maybe smaller pockets and maybe employee resource groups. But, we saw it on a large scale in 2020. And so I do think a lot of people don't really understand what this work is all about, and particularly because we don't give enough airtime to the differences between diversity, equity, and inclusion. We just say it all together as one thing. Now, I do think there is a camp of folks that I don't want to let off the hook, that know exactly what this work is about, and particularly what equity work is about, and they don't want it to take hold. So equity is about understanding that all systems may not have been created fair to begin with. And so equity is all about giving people an opportunity to thrive and to succeed by making sure they have equal access to resources and making sure that we are accounting for historical systems of inequality. Some of that looks like, thinking about our hiring practices. Are we going for a diverse pipeline of candidates? Are we making sure our interviews are experiences that are very objective and not just, hiring based on vibes and if we like someone or because we went to school with them, right? But, the folks that are touting anti-DEI, they very much know that if we have equity, it means that we are dismantling those historical systems and structures that did create unfair advantages. And people are motivated to keep the status quo, which is what really we are seeing this pushback about. People don't want to change the status quo, and they want to keep, folks that are not in the majority in the minority.
You're listening to The Metro on WDET, Detroit Public Radio. I'm Robin Vincent.
And I'm Tia Graham. We're speaking with Professor Ella F. Washington, an organizational psychologist at George Washington University. And we're talking about the uncertain future of diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. So, Professor Washington, President Donald Trump called DEI efforts radical and wasteful while signing an executive order to end those programs in federal agencies. The White House press secretary also followed up Tuesday, saying that removing DEI programs will return America to a merit-based society. What do you say to folks who believe DEI is unfair and primarily harms the most qualified individuals?
Well, I think we have to be honest about what meritocracy is and what it's not, right? Meritocracy sounds good. And it's the idea that success is based on pulling yourself up by your bootstraps and, making sure you're talented, you work hard, and you have the knowledge and skills to do the job. And that is great. And, if we lived in a world where that was actually true, that everyone had those same opportunities just based off of their intelligence and working hard, then I would be all for merit. However, the reality is that, meritocracy is not often fair. There are things like cronyism and nepotism that often play a role in who's hired, who's chosen for positions, or who gets certain opportunities. And so meritocracy itself is a myth. When we think about equity, as opposed to meritocracy, equity acknowledges those historic systems and efforts that were disadvantaging people in minority groups and historically marginalized groups, right? And so when you have equity, that is what we're going for, would create a system of fairness for everyone. Folks who are pushing back and touting meritocracy, they're conveniently ignoring some of the things that don't make the playing field even for everyone. And so we can say we want meritocracy, we want everyone to be treated the same, but if everyone's not starting from the same starting point, then there will never be equality, there will never be fairness, and we'll continue to see the gaps in success and achievement for those groups that have been historically marginalized.
So you mentioned how DEI is a way to address systemic inequalities. How can DEI be explained to someone who doesn't yet acknowledge or quite understand historic systemic biases?
I mean, I think you look at the data, right? You look at the data of, okay, if you look at the population of the United States, X amount of folks in these different demographic categories. Look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, X amount of folks in the workforce, right? Period. And then you look at different levels in organizations. You look at frontline levels, you look at mid-management levels, you look at senior executive levels, right? And you quickly see that while even companies that have diversity on the front lines of their organizations, when you go up through the ranks of the organizations, those numbers fall off. They fall off for demographic minorities. They fall off for women. They fall off for, basically people who are not considered in the majority, right? And so, yeah, I would say if you don't want to acknowledge history, you are being willfully ignorant because there's so much resources. There's so many resources out there. There's so much history, and you can really just look at the numbers and see there's clearly a gap between the experiences of some groups versus others in the workplace.
So if DEI is not deemed insignificant from a federal level, how does that impact your work?
Well, I work a lot with the private sector. And so, the private sector right now is reeling in many ways along these topics. They're trying to figure out what will be legal and what's illegal because they certainly want to make sure they're in compliance. But they're also looking at, what areas they're pushing back if they are trying to stay committed to this work. Now, all organizations are not. We've already seen in the media organizations like Target and Walmart have said, we're pulling the plug on DEI. We're not going to do this anymore. It's not aligned with our values. But then you see other companies pushing back in a very intentional way, companies like Costco, that have said, hey, we are still committed to this work, and we're going to make sure that we continue to create environments where everyone can thrive, create environments where we're meeting our customers' needs, and we're not going to back down just because some folks don't like, creating those spaces for everyone.
Professor Elo F. Washington is an organizational psychologist and a professor of practice at Georgetown University and the author of the book Necessary Journey, Making Real Progress on Equity and Inclusion. And actually, we do have a caller really quickly, Professor Washington, that we would like to go to. And she wants to make a comment about Target. Caller, are you there?
Okay, well, we'll get back to the phones in just a moment.
I think we lost the caller. Oh, man.
Please give us a call back. We have to take a quick break. We'll be back with more on the Metro. Stay with us.
Welcome back to the Metro on 101.9 WDET FM. I'm Tia Graham.
And I'm Robin Vincent. Since President Trump ordered to scale back DEI initiatives, companies have started following his lead. Many are abandoning or dramatically scaling back on their DEI initiatives. But what could these changes mean for minority-owned local businesses that in some cases rely on major partnerships to thrive? Rachel Allen is the co-founder of Centric Place. It's a co-working space and incubator for local entrepreneurs. Rachel, welcome to the Metro.
Thank you for having me.
So tell us, what are your initial reactions? What were they to President Trump's ending of federal DEI efforts?
Well, I have to tell you, it was complete chaos yesterday. I was getting calls from all parts of the state with people having questions and concerns, but mostly fear and anxiety about what the future of our organizations will look like should this funding not only go away, but in some cases be clawed back. And so that's the part that makes it unprecedented, is it means that dollars that have already been earmarked for programming for small businesses could possibly never make it into the hands of those businesses.
And you're talking specific. You're not talking necessarily about DEI efforts ending, but federal funding. Is that right?
Absolutely. So there's a lot of swirling conversation, and to be honest, some misinformation as well that's insinuating that the federal freeze would mean that trillions of dollars, and in our case in the state of Michigan, millions of dollars that had come through the Fed, that come through the state, that end up in the hands of nonprofits such as ours, Operation School, would essentially go away. And at the core of this matter, it means that programming that is aimed towards Black and brown and historically excluded small business owners would no longer have access to not only those programs, but grants and resources. The entire landscape for small business education could dramatically change across the country.
Okay, so this is then sort of in addition to what we've been talking about, which are the ending of DEI efforts, but how this federal funding and the pausing of it is going to indirectly affect diversity in businesses and businesses owned by people of color and folks of color in the workforce.
Absolutely. So in particular, Operation School at Centric Place is one of 27 small business support hubs across the state of Michigan. And those hubs were directly created through support through the ARPA dollars, which are tied to COVID relief. So what makes some of this programming a bit unique is that it's not just specific to historically excluded communities, but those impacted directly by COVID. But the kind of end result is that it's meant to create opportunities and programming and a holistic ecosystem for those small businesses who are opening businesses right there in each of our communities. And so while most people are focused on just the DEI conversation that's happening, I think there are everyday people who might be completely unaware that yesterday's conversation around this funding going away will directly impact almost everyone in some of their day-to-day quality of life matters.
Talk a little bit more about access to this funding and losing it and what that looks like both for you and the organizations that you work with. Give us more a clear sense.
I would say there's a few things that are in jeopardy here. So at the top of this, it means that organizations such as ours would essentially lose dollars that have already been earmarked from both the state and the Fed. So specifically for Operation School, we are talking essentially $2 million over the next 2 years that has already been allocated for that programming. It means that we contract then with service partners and other business supporting organizations. We also support small businesses and contractors and subject matter experts that provide our training or our technical assistance to our businesses. So that means an entire ecosystem of service providers would not have access to that funding. It means that our classes that are traditionally free to our small businesses, they might now have to have a charge associated with them. But I think in the worst case of this is that all of that programming goes away, because now what we're also talking about is other dollars now being harder to get. If the federal money starts to dry up, then it means that there's more pressure on corporate and philanthropic support. And now we have more organizations fighting for a smaller pool of resources. And so essentially that makes organizations like ours have to make really difficult decisions. We're looking at actively having to lay off or terminate staff, close programming, or in some cases, merge with other organizations. All of these things are on the table because at the core of this, our heart is on how this is impacting the small business owners. And so I will say that while there's a lot of confusion happening right now, the folks that I am tapped into in the ecosystem are ready to fight. And we've come this far to support the small business owners, and we're not going to stop just at the threat of our funding being taken away.
Rachel, thank you for helping us to visualize some of these scenarios. Let's go back to the phones. Andrea from Oak Park, what do you think about DEI in corporate America or in small businesses?
Yeah, what a great topic. Can you hear me this time?
Yes.
Awesome. Great topic and so necessary. Look, I wasn't surprised by Donald Trump's move. I'm not surprised by anything he does. It's all outrageous. It's all way too dramatic. What I was very disappointed with and found absolutely unnecessary was big corporations such as Target, who decided that they were going to make a public pronouncement that they were eliminating the DEI practices. And if any of us remember Target 30 years ago about that, when they came to Michigan, the corporate structure, the executives all looked the same. It was a homogeneous group of blonde-haired, blue-eyed white men. And maybe that reflects Minneapolis's origins, the immigrant origins there. But it was clear to anybody who was interested in advancing in Target, if they didn't look like that, it just didn't seem like you would be included or you even had the possibilities of advancement. But then Target, I don't know if anyone remembers, they were sued for discrimination. And from that came a commitment to DEI. And so now when you go to Target, everybody loves Target. What you see now is a far richer corporation. You see a mix of people. You see Muslims and blacks and whites and Native Americans and Indians. It's really a much richer, more wonderful place to visit. And not only were they pushed into hiring more diverse team members, they also, in their training, made sure that team members were sensitized to different cultures, that we would treat somebody with a head covering, be that Muslim or Jewish, the same as anybody else, that we would welcome them in, that we would be sensitive to different cultures of people that shop with us. And I thought that was a very healthy thing. I don't want to see that go away. It made Target better. Okay?
Andrea, thank you so much for giving us a call on the Metro. I'm going to have to stop you right there, but I do appreciate your thoughts. And I want to bring Rachel back into the conversation here and highlight the fact that, again, that you support a lot of Black-owned businesses in the area. And so I want to go back to DEI efforts for a moment, if we could. Could the president's actions to eliminate DEI efforts at the federal level, could that impact the work that you're doing?
It absolutely could. I think that the fact that we are specific about our work directly supporting those from historically excluded communities, which at the core of this are Black and brown folks, women, all of the folks on this spectrum, when we're targeting efforts that are meant to level the playing field, it means that programs that specifically call out race and gender could be attacked. And so at the core of this issue, I really want people to understand that the fact that the federal government has approved so much funding towards this leveling of the playing field, it acknowledges that it was uneven to begin with. And so if these DEI practices are successful, it seriously threatens our ability to be able to secure federal funding, which is a core component of nonprofit fundraising. It means that could essentially go away.
I want to go back to the phone lines. Teresa in Beverly Hills, thank you for calling the Metro. What's on your mind?
I feel that that prejudice comes from fear. And to fight prejudice it takes education. And our civilization cannot proceed with we're sliding backwards. Our wonderful President Obama said it's not a straight up line, but to proceed to develop our civilization, we need these concepts that our fear should not be dominating our decisions, and to promote people that have not started, did not have the privilege that we had.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Teresa, thank you for giving us a call. And I want to close things out with you, Rachel, in asking, how are you now going to plan for the foreseeable future in the last minute we have, given this conversation both about the pause on funding, federal funding, and then also on DEI efforts more broadly?
Well, I say to start, we're watching the news very closely. There's another hearing scheduled for Monday, which we're hoping will provide a bit more guidance on what these next steps will include. But even if we are somehow spared from this particular set of cuts, we're thinking about how to completely overhaul our organization so that we can be leaner, more efficient, and less reliant on government funding. And again, if we're offered the opportunity to see the funding through, we're going to be thinking about ways that we can grow and continue to keep our programming free to our small business owners. Again, we're not losing sight of the fact that our stakeholders are the small businesses in the community, particularly those who are Black and brown, and we're not going to stop fighting for them. We're just going to get more creative, more innovative, and more disruptive so that our work doesn't come to an end.
Rachel Allen is the co-founder of Centric Place. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us on the Metro today.
Thank you for having me.
That's the Metro for Wednesday, January 29th. The Metro is a production of WDET and Wayne State University. The Metro is produced by Sam, Corey, David, Lyons, Carey Jr. II, and Jack Philbrandt. Our interns are Lauren and Trevor. This is WDET FM, Detroit Public Radio, your connection to news, music, and conversation.